Okay, so today we're going to be talking about trauma. So trauma is essentially an experience that one has along their life, usually as a child. Essentially, the nervous system has an experience that is so powerful that it cannot compute, that it just cannot process this information. And which is also why it usually happens as children or in the younger years, because our nervous system isn't developed yet, our psychological system isn't strong enough to handle such shock. And ultimately what happens is, well, there's two options here of what can happen. Either your nervous system just shuts down entirely, which was first discovered as shell shock in World War One. The soldiers, they experienced something so awful that they just stopped being. And you become comatose, a vegetable. Or ultimately your subconscious, your inner healing mechanism kicks in and goes and suppresses it, because this is too much to handle right now. We're going to suppress it. We're not going to deal with it right now. We're going to deal with it at a later date. So what happens is, because the experience, the emotion in your nervous system isn't processed, you get frozen. That little piece of time of when the traumatic experience happened gets frozen within your nervous system, so that it doesn't get integrated, and though it does get suppressed for the time being, it comes back, and it comes back around. This is what happens when you get triggered, that when an individual experiences a situation that reminds them or is similar to this past experience, that emotional state, which is frozen in their body, gets activated, and then they react as if they're in the past, reliving that experience. This is why the person is no longer dealing with the present situation around them, and is no longer responding appropriately or meeting the same level that the present experience requires, and may go over. An example of this is, you can see two people arguing, and the more heated and upset they get, the more irrelevant the information they're talking about is to the present situation. They'll bring up the past more often, especially if they know each other and have a history together. Like, oh, well, what about that one time? And, all these things come out. And what the subconscious is doing, so essentially your conscious mind, is going about through life having these experiences, and and when you have this experience, it's too powerful for the conscious mind, so it gets suppressed to the subconscious mind. And what your subconscious mind is doing, one of its many jobs is to heal you and to integrate and process. It is the immune system of your psychological state. And its job is to say, hey, remember this powerful, painful experience you had? Now we need to deal with it. Now we need to integrate it so that we can move on. It is information, it is data, it is taking up energy that we could use elsewhere. If you're fighting a battle on two fronts, you get exhausted. But if the past is integrated and processed, then you have more energy to deal with the future. And even more so, ultimately what the trauma is a lesson that when the emotional pain of it and the energy of it is discharged, the kernel of information and data that is useful then gets integrated, processed, integrated, and becomes a part of you. It's no longer problematic, it's no longer causing a hitch in the system or a hiccup, and ultimately fuels you towards the better. You can deal with new situations better, even more, stressful situations. You can even teach. And this is such an important process to the psychological experience of being a self, that so much energy is regulated towards it. Not just like nightmares, for example. Not the only reason, but a large part of nightmares isn't learning experience, is ultimately your subconscious being like, hey, remember these unresolved issues. It's not there to torture you. It's not there to trick you or punish you for experiences you haven't dealt with. It's ultimately trying to remind you and trying to coax you out of it. Now, the thing is, the initial experience gets suppressed. It's deemed too painful to process, so it just gets ignored completely, and we can't even touch it. We can't even get close to it because it's too painful. But ultimately, over time, that energy starts seeping out, which is a good thing because it, releases the energy and we start remembering it. Now, what we should do as a society is have a vessel and container to have these experiences and relive them in safe settings. But we don't. And modern society completely kind of forgot about this and just said, due to religion, was like, all right, do this, and if you don't do this, you're bad and it's your fault and you get punished for it. And there was no like practical active steps, and that didn't work, so psychology was born. So your subconscious is trying to get you to remember the information that did not get integrated, the experiences you had that are still living within your body and that are affecting your mind and impeding your mind from being its fullest, or not your mind, your soul, from being its fullest self, from your personality expressing itself fully without like deterrents and hindrances, because it will trigger past trauma. But the problem then, and the issue with nightmares, is that how do you get someone to look at something they're purposefully trying not to look at? You disguise it. You disguise it as something else. You use it as metaphors. Also, symbols is the realm of the soul, so everything is made of images and shapes and symbols. And that's just like the language of that realm. Your nightmares are metaphors or disguises for what it is your subconscious is trying to get you to remember, the experiences you're trying to face and relive. Sleep and the dream world have many uses and cases. It is a connection to the spirit world in essence, but also there is a kind of learning process going on. There's, while the body sleeps, the mind can spend more time going inward and be like, all right, this is the information we picked up, this is the information we haven't processed, how do we put this together? Ultimately, what you need to know is that your experience is participatory. It's not just the subconscious is trying to work with you, but you ultimately have to make the decision. You ultimately have to actively engage and choose to work with your subconscious. After all, we are not only subconscious creatures, we are not only conscious creatures. It's both and. Other examples, and the thing is that because it's internal and it's unprocessed, it kind of boils over, it builds. That the more you don't deal with your trauma, the more powerful and painful it gets, because it compounds. Other experiences that remind you of it build on top of it, and it gets bigger and bigger. You can think of character armor, and just like every time you encounter another experience that reminds you of your trauma and re-traumatizes you, that triggers you and re-traumatizes you, you can think of another callus building on top of your already callous, stiff character armor, right? And so, but ultimately, the reverse is true, that when dealing with your trauma, not in such in broad, crude terms, but that ultimately what the goal and the key of the healing process is you have to get to that core experience that caused this entire family tree of biographical history, in a sense, and deal with what I like to call the origin trauma. I don't know if that's an actual term, but it sounds useful to me. And you deal with the core experience that then, once dealt with, processed, and integrated, relieves everything else, frees up all that psychological energy to be used for other things. So this is an internal process, but ultimately, because it builds and builds and builds and boils, it spills out into the world around us. And as my therapist likes to say, what you don't deal with comes out sideways. And this is what we can think of when we think of subconscious behaviors that we commit and that other people commit without realizing they're doing it. When we get triggered, when an individual gets triggered, we behave automatically. We behave without thinking. You can think of snapping at someone on the subway or on the sidewalk when they didn't really do anything, they just bumped you. They didn't bump you on purpose, but you react as if they did because because ultimately it's not your conscious mind that's doing things, it's your body, it's your nervous system that's reacting to the threat, It's not a response, it's a reaction. So in that sense, it is automatic. And we also need to understand that our emotions are physical sensations within the body, physical states within the body. So our nervous system is activated and changes us and morphs us into certain ways. And therefore, so when you can think of it as possession in a sense, or when we think of people as being possessed, or when we think back of, I don't know what came over me, that ultimately what's happening is that this previous emotional state, this physical nervous system state is frozen within you and activated and does take over you, If this situation is achieved, then this emotional state will be enacted, kind of a sense. And you lose your faculties and your sense of self and the sense of who you are in this moment, and you revert back to whatever age it was that trauma happened. This is why you can have people who are, adult in their years and even wise and intelligent in other regards of their lives or experiences, but when it comes to certain specific areas, revert back to being an infant or a child or a teenager You can also think of it, it doesn't have to be strong examples so much like trauma, or even negative examples. We can even think of positive experiences of when siblings get together, even though they are all accomplished within their respective fields of study or careers or what have you, or other areas of their life. They can be very well developed and mature people, but then when they get together, they revert to being silly little children. A great, a positive reversion, one could say. And something needs to be said for that as well, that the reverse of trauma is also true, but these aren't experiences that deter us. I don't know what the exact phrase is, but I'm going to use the word triumph, that you can have positive core experiences that then fuel you and dictate the rest of the course of your life. A child builds their own box cart, and the rush of driving down a hill in their own box cart for the very first time had such a powerful experience that it then led them to want to pursue becoming a Formula One racer. Stuff like that. Exaggerated example, but you get the idea. And so this is also true. Ultimately, the core being, how do we deal with powerful experiences? Well, a powerful negative experience is a little different, but the mechanics are similar. When our trauma bleeds out into the world around us, we no longer see the world around us because we are caught in our past. And what I need to emphasize here, and what we need to understand, is this is all an automatic experience. We're not aware we're doing this. We're not aware it's happening, and we're not aware that other people are doing this. This is why one must spend time doing the work, or what is known as doing the work, going inward and internalizing and being introspective, not only about what you are thinking, but even more importantly, what you are feeling. And this is not an up here experience, this is in here. How is my body reacting to that situation? What are the changes taking place in my chemical construct and makeup that then have a knock-on effect? Where do I feel this in my body? Your organs are talking to you, listen to them. When we are triggered, we do not see the world around us. And if we stay in a state, you can imagine a person who has suffered so much trauma or so much experience, and for such a prolonged period of time, which is, compound trauma, which is also known as complex PTSD. PTSD is what is more popularly known as what you see on TV and in Hollywood, of a general big experience that then has a lasting effect. Complex PTSD, you can think of the same thing as compound interest, where it's a bunch of little traumas over time that slowly build and build. So there's not one particular experience, more like a certain type of experience or behavior of experience that are all related. Ultimately, there too, it comes down to a core experience, but it's harder to suss out and differentiate. And I would argue most of us have the latter than the former. And so the latter becomes much more complicated to deal with, because you have to the map gets bigger, and you have to draw out the map and study and, and watch yourself. And it is really cause and effect. To think of it like that helps. So if we think of our world and our reality or society as a whole, as different individuals all getting triggered and reacting and triggering each other off of each other's reactions, then what you end up having, and if you understand the idea that when an individual is triggered, they're not dealing with the present moment, they're caught in the past. But the past doesn't actually exist because it's the past. So what they're dealing is a fantasy illusion, a memory. It's not even a memory. There's no real such thing as memory. Memory is a malleable, transient experience, as we've come to understand in the last few years. Ultimately, this person is living a fantasy or a delusion, but I prefer not to use that word. That's more of a shameful negative term. Let's just stick with the word fantasy. They're not dealing with the reality in here in the moment. They're dealing with a projection of it, an idea of what reality might be. It might be correct, but it might not be, but ultimately we don't know, because it's our model of the situation instead of the situation itself. The map is not the territory. So if you have a person who is triggered and they're projecting their assumptions of what might be happening, and these assumptions are incorrect, and not only that, this can happen in harmless ways too, or more milder ways. It can even happen in positive ways too. We can project an experience to be more positive than it is, and we want it to be more positive than it is, so we make it out to be. So we're living in the delusion of the fantasy. We're not dealing with the reality of the situation. So then you have a person who is dealing with an illusory reality. They're not reacting to the truth. Now, if you have this person who is triggered dealing with another person who's triggered, they are both not only not communicating with reality itself, but with each other. And because of the nature of emotion itself, let alone trauma, they're bouncing off each other and feeding back into each other. So the experience builds and builds and builds. So this delusional experience that they're both having may even converge a little, but they do definitely amplify each other until hopefully it gets dealt with in a safe way or in a constructive way, but also can be dealt with in an explosive, violent, and destructive way. And if we live in an unhealthy society where this kind of behavior becomes the norm, whether it's intentional or not, and just becomes understood that this is what we are as a society, then the society itself becomes a traumatized society where everybody instead of communicating with each other are triggering each other, which is what we see in the modern world currently, for the most part, not always. But the core idea to understand here is that at no point is anyone dealing with the situation itself, with the physical present reality of what is. We're all getting lost in ideas of what we think could be happening. The solution to this, barring, long-term practices and behaviors, although that is ultimately the goal and the key and the only way through, is that one, on the individual level, one needs to understand their psyche, and most importantly, their subconscious. One needs to understand their triggers. One needs to understand the way their body and their nervous system. I know for myself, I had a long time having difficulty with this because I kept thinking of it as a mental experience, as a thought process in my head that I could just think my way out of the solution. And it wasn't. It was a physical experience, and that if I did not acknowledge the physical experience I'm having and then the reactions my body was having to the world around me, I made no headway. I made no advancement whatsoever, no matter how intelligent my mental trickery was. And ultimately, that this is primary and this secondary. I point at the brain, but the mind doesn't exist in the brain, right? It's not a top-down solution. We think that we can just force ourselves to do things by just thinking about it or being extra aggressive, and that it's the complete opposite. It's bottom up. Body first, then mind, If you want to have a healthier experience in life, if you want to have a calmer experience, then you have to eat right, then you have to sleep right, then you have to exercise right. This is not necessarily the only thing. It most certainly is not, but it is definitely a good framework and foundation and a necessary part in order to achieve health. And I know, at least for me, that when I did think of it that way, and when I did focus on the more physical aspects of my body, that the emotional and the mental aspect got easier. Not necessarily solved, but easier. So one has to deal with that reality, to accept reality as it is, not as we want it to be, not as we fear it to be, but what is actually happening. A large deterrent to this is the emotion of shame and guilt, the idea that we deserve to be punished for ignorance, that if we do not know something, that's our fault, which is illogical. How can you not know how can you be responsible for something you did not have access to begin with? This comes from cultural trauma over the years, and the psychological cultural tradition of punishing children, and the idea that children are responsible somehow for their ignorance, which is illogical, but that's really just the trauma that we experience as adults that we then pass on to our children. Ultimately, the idea being there is no shame in being ignorant because you did not choose to be ignorant or even were aware you were ignorant to begin with. Children are supposed to be ignorant. That's what they are. That's what children are. They literally just got here. So how that plays on into the rest of our lives is that we feel ashamed of our mistakes. And you need to understand that shame is very powerful. It is a very traumatizing experience, to the point that when you have an experience of a mistake or something you did wrong, your nervous system, not everyone, but most people, because of this type of behavior, goes, we feel pain. And you don't, you automatically, the nervous system doesn't want to feel pain. So if you associate learning and making mistakes with pain, you're not going to remember your mistakes because they're too painful to remember. And shame and guilt have a lot to do with this. We can think of children in school being shamed in not getting the answer right, not getting the multiplication right. Well, You're not supposed to get it right. You're supposed to make mistakes. You're supposed to say the wrong thing. It is a good thing to say the wrong thing because it's how you grow and learn. You build on it to get to a solution, not the solution, because there never is the solution. There's only a solution or more solutions. And you're supposed to build and grow and evolve. And we need to encourage that as a society, and to not just have this as an intellectual understanding, but as emotional programming, that making mistakes is a noble thing, a proud thing, because it is proof that you tried and that you wanted to try. So this is a large part of why society is the way it is. And yes, to collectively cultivate a community that does that for each other, but that is more convoluted and complicated and involved. So on the individual level, which is easier to manage and deal with and more direct, and you get results faster. On the individual level, do not shame yourself for your mistakes. Do not shame or punish yourself for getting things wrong, or not being what everybody else thinks you're supposed to be, because you're not supposed to be that. And ultimately, because there is no shame in being a flawed person. There's no shame in being imperfect or having limitations. You will no matter, even if you achieve everything and get everything right, as impossible as it is, you will still be limited. You will still be flawed. There will still be shortcomings, because that is the nature of reality itself. Reality itself is an imperfection. A perfect reality is a homogeneous reality, and therefore, and if that was ever true, then it wouldn't exist. Nothing would happen, because nothing could be out of balance in order for things to happen. There would be no motion. And life is motion, created out of motion. So if reality itself, if universe is born out of an imperfection and is the result of an imperfection, then why should you be ashamed for being imperfect? So that is a number one marker to help you move forward. And then understanding that your trauma, it comes down to the idea of shame and blame and punishment. Your trauma is not your fault. The pain that you had, the experiences that you had, was not a choice you made. That was a choice someone else made. Not only that someone else made, but that someone else made when you were a child. And children are inherently defenseless because they don't know. They don't have access to it because it never happened, hasn't happened yet. They haven't learned or built up the skills or the emotional tool belt to defend themselves from such painful experiences. So you are not responsible for not responding to the situation accordingly or appropriately or by other people's standards. Humiliation has a large part to do with this. Oh, look, they didn't do it right. Oh, look, he peed himself. Ha! Make fun of the guy. That is an awful thing to do to someone, and is just logically incorrect. There's no responsibleness in being punished. It's not a responsible thing to hate yourself or punish yourself for your mistakes. It doesn't make you better at the situation, so that logic flies out the window. Also, that's a cruel thing to do. So if anybody has treated you in this way, or you treated someone else in this way, that's not rational. And it doesn't matter that society tells us that this is rational and that our judicial system is built this way. It doesn't change the fact that it isn't, for the simple fact that it does not make society safer or more conducive or harmonious, and most importantly, efficient. It actually does the reverse. So the fact that we have our society, culture, and tradition tell us that this is rational, that it's all for the greater good, is simply false and just wrong and mean. So that argument goes out the window. You are supposed to be nice to yourself. You're supposed to be compassionate to yourself when you make mistakes. Start from a place of accepting your mistakes without judgment. Now, without judgment, for me personally, was always a hard thing to think of, like, what does that mean? I didn't understand what that meant. And the way that helped me understand was without movement. If this is true, then it means that, or it means this, or I'm the greatest thing in the world, or I'm the worst thing in the world. All or nothing comes from trauma, because it's the fight or flight response. And if I didn't move in either of directions and just told myself, no, sit with what is. This happened and it made me feel that way, or I feel this way, or I did that. And there's no what comes next. There's no future or past of no cause and effect, just this happened. And accept the reality of what you're in. And a large part of this experience is, again, not a thought process. It's an emotional experience. You have to sit with the emotion of it. You have to accept the feeling. And ultimately, what heals us from our trauma is allowing the feeling to exist. is allowing ourselves to feel what we're feeling, to feel what happened to us. At a younger age, our nervous system was not developed enough for us to handle it. At a older age, it's still difficult, but it's more possible, it's more accessible. And ultimately, what we're talking about is energy. And energy needs to be dissipated, needs to be transmuted and transformed, and the only way that happens is by letting it through. In a safe way, in a safe setting, of course, but ultimately, yes, it needs to pass through. And so without that experience, you can have, cognitive techniques, you can have mental constructs and physical practices to help you. Of course, it takes a village. You need all these tools in your tool belt, but ultimately at its core is emotion, is energy, and energy just needs to happen. You need to let it be, because ultimately what is happening is those are younger versions of yourself that you are denying. Those are the children aspects of yourself that know you don't have a right to exist, you don't get to exist, which not only is mean, but is also illogical. To cut off your younger versions of selves and say that they don't get to exist means you don't get to move forward, because they're the foundations that which you are built upon now. If you do not have access to your foundations, or your foundations aren't stable, you can't move forward. You can't build upon that. And no matter how much you build, no matter how much you try, you will simply crumble back down to the level of where you are traumatized, of where you did not move on and what you did not integrate. And you can't move forward. This is why your subconscious expends so much energy trying to get you to remember, trying to get you to focus, trying to get you to concentrate and say, hey, no, this is important, this matters, we're not moving forward until this happens. Another reason is because it's automatic. It's an automatic system. This can't happen unless this happens, and if this didn't happen, I don't care how much you want it, this is not gonna happen. You have to deal with this. You have to deal with the reality of the situation. You have to feel what you're feeling. These are all very difficult things. These are all very painful and powerful things. It's okay that you don't get it right the first time, second time, 10th time, 100th time. Repetition is the key to all learning. Growth is non-linear. You reverse, you repeat, it happens. Reality or emotional reality is a spiral. It doesn't matter that you repeat it over and over again, because each time it gets deeper, each time it gets newer, each time there's a little bit more detail. And then if you deal with it long enough, at a certain point you can stand back and realize that this spiral is creating a tapestry. It is creating a tree of life, your own internal family tree of emotion, and that this is the tapestry of you. And that is a wonderful thing. So as always, be kind to yourself, go easy on yourself, and thank you for being you.